629, Peter the Great died in 1725. To secure his revolution, he had decreed that each czar should name his successor, but he himself had named none and had put to death his own son Alexis to prevent social reaction. Peter's long reign was therefore followed by a period of political instability. Rival factions at court, a German party and a native Russian party, struggled for control over successive czars, czarinas, and short-lived governments until a palace revolution in 1741 brought to the throne Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth, who managed to hold power until her death 21 years later. Russian military power expanded during her reign, and she entered into European diplomacy and joined in the 7 Years' War against Prussia, fearing that the continued growth of Prussia would endanger the new Russian position on the Baltic. Her nephew, Peter III, was almost immediately dethroned and probably assassinated by a group acting in the name of his young wife, Catherine. The victorious coterie claimed that Peter III had been an incompetent, childlike czar who at the age of 24 still played with paper soldiers. Using such rumors to justify her rise to power, Catherine was proclaimed the Empress Catherine II and later came to be called the Great. She enjoyed a long reign from 1762 to 1796, during which she acquired a somewhat exaggerated reputation as an enlightened despot. The names of the czars and czarinas between Peter I and Catherine II are of slight importance, but their violent and rapid sequence tells a story. With no principle of succession, dynastic or other, the empire fell into a lawless struggle of parties, in which plots against ruling czars alternated with palace revolutions upon their death. In all the confusion, an underlying issue was always how Peter's European reform program would turn out. Although Russia's social elites were becoming more European, most people in Western Europe still viewed Russia as an alien and remote place on the distant frontier of European culture. 343, 630. Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, domestic program. Catherine the Great was a German woman of a small princely house of the Holy Roman Empire. She had gone to Russia at the age of 15 to be married. She had immediately cultivated the goodwill of the Russians, learned the language, and embraced the Orthodox Church. Early in her married life, disgusted with her husband, she foresaw the chance of becoming empress herself. Like the other prominent woman ruler of this era in Europe, Maria Theresa, she approached political issues with a strong practical sense and great energy, though she did not share Maria Theresa's devotion to family life. Catherine's intellectual powers were as remarkable as her physical vigor. Even after becoming empress, she often got up at 5 in the morning, lit her own fire, and turned to her books, making a digest, for example, of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, published in 1765. She corresponded with Voltaire and invited Diderot, editor of the Encyclopédie, to visit her at St. Petersburg, where she reported, he thumped her so hard on the knee during their energetic conversations that she had to put a table between them. She bought Diderot's library, allowing him to keep it during his lifetime, and in other ways won international renown by her benefactions to the philosophes, whom she regarded as useful press agents for Russia. When she first came to power, she publicized an intention to introduce certain enlightened reforms. She summoned a great consultative assembly, called a legislative commission, which met in 1767. From its numerous proposals, Catherine obtained a good deal of information on conditions in the country and concluded from the profuse loyalty exhibited by the deputies that though a usurper and a foreigner, she possessed a strong hold upon Russia. She subsequently enacted reforms that included a new legal codification, restrictions on the use of torture, and a limited support of religious toleration, though she would not allow old believers to build their own chapels. Such innovations were enough to raise an admiring chorus from the philosophes, who saw in her, as they saw retrospectively in Peter the Great, the standard bearer of an enlightened civilization among a backward people. 631. Whatever early ideas Catherine may conceivably have held on the fundamental subject of reforming serfdom in Russia did not last long after she became empress, and there was no consideration of reform after the great peasant insurrection of 1773, known as Pugachev's Rebellion. The condition of the Russian serfs was deteriorating. Serf owners were increasingly selling them apart from the land, breaking up families, using them in mines or manufactures, disciplining and punishing them at will, or exiling them to Siberia. The serf population was restless, worked upon by the religious warnings of old believers, and cherishing distorted popular memories of the mighty hero, Stephen Raisin, who a century before had led an uprising against the landlords. Class antagonism, though latent, was profound, and it may have grown when the rough mujik, in some places, heard the lord and his family talking French so as not to be understood by the servants, or saw them wearing European clothes, reading European books, and adopting the manners of a foreign way of life. In 1773, a Don Cossack, Emelian Pugachev, a former soldier, appeared at the head of an insurrection in the Urals. Following an old Russian custom, he announced himself as the true Tsar, Peter III, Catherine's deceased husband, now returned after long travels in Egypt and the Holy Land. He surrounded himself with his own imperial family, courtiers, and even a secretary of state. He issued an imperial manifesto proclaiming the end of serfdom, taxes, and military conscription. In the Urals and Volga regions, hundreds of thousands Tartars, 340 to 630 Kyrgyz, Cossacks, agricultural serfs, servile workers in the Ural mines, fishermen in the rivers and in the Caspian Sea, flocked to Pugachev's banner. The great host surged through eastern Russia, burning and pillaging, killing priests and landlords. The upper classes in Moscow were terrified. 100,000 serfs lived in the city as domestic servants or industrial workers, and their sympathies went out to Pugachev and his militant supporters. Armies sent against him were at first unsuccessful, but famine along the Volga in 1774 dispersed the rebels. Pugachev, betrayed by some of his own followers, was brought to Moscow in an iron cage. Catherine forbade the use of torture at his trial, but he was executed by the drawing and quartering of his body, a punishment, it should perhaps be noted, used at the time in Western Europe in cases of flagrant treason. Pugachev's Rebellion. Catherine the Great by Alexander Roslin, Swedish, 1718 to 1793. Catherine's forceful character and slightly whimsical smile are represented in this portrait, which was painted shortly after the powerful Tsarina suppressed the Great Peasant Rebellion of 1773 to 1774. Heritage Images, Getty Images. Pugachev's rebellion was the most violent peasant uprising in the history of Russia and the most formidable mass upheaval in Europe in the century before 1789. Catherine replied to it by repression. She conceded more powers to the landlords. The nobles shook off the last vestiges of the compulsory state service to which Peter had bound them, 633. The peasants were henceforth the only bound or unfree class. As in Prussia, the state came more than ever to rest on an understanding between ruler and gentry, by which the gentry accepted the monarchy, with its laws, officials, army, and foreign policy, and received from it, in return, the assurance of full authority over the rural masses. Government reached down through the aristocracy and the scattered towns, but it stopped short at the manor. There the lord took over and was himself a kind of government in his own person. Under these conditions, the number of serfs increased, and the load on each 345 634 became heavier. Catherine's reign saw the culmination of Russian serfdom, which now ceased to differ in any important respect from the chattel slavery that controlled the lives of enslaved blacks in the Americas. One might read in the Moscow Gazette demeaning notices for the sale of human beings, such as the following advertisements. For sale, 2 plump coachmen, 2 girls 18 and 15 years, quick at manual work. 2 barbers, one 21, knows how to read and write and play a musical instrument, the other can do ladies' and gentlemen's hair. Catherine the Great, Foreign Affairs. Territorially, Catherine was one of the main builders of modern Russia. When she became Tsarina in 1762, the empire reached to the Pacific and into Central Asia, and it touched upon the Gulf of Riga and the Gulf of Finland on the Baltic. But westward from Moscow, one could go only 200 miles before reaching Poland, and no one standing on Russian soil could see the waters of the Black Sea. See maps, pp. 236 to 237. Russia was separated from Central Europe by a wide band of loosely organized domains, extending from the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and nominally belonging to the Polish and Turkish states. Poland was an old enemy, but in both Poland and the Ottoman Empire, there were many Greek Orthodox Christians with whom Russians felt an ideological tie. Catherine's supreme plan was to penetrate the entire area, Polish and Ottoman territories alike. In a war with the Ottoman Empire in 1772, she developed her Greek Project, in which Greeks, that is, members of the Greek Orthodox Church, would replace Muslims as the dominant element throughout the Middle East. She defeated the Ottoman forces in the war, but was herself checked by the diplomatic pressures of the European balance of power. The result was the first partition of Poland, a seizure of land and people in which the monarchs of Prussia, Russia, and Austria began to divide up Polish territory between them. Frederick took Pomerelia, which he renamed West Prussia. Catherine took parts of Byelorussia. Maria Theresa occupied Galicia. Frederick digested his portion with relish, realizing an old dream of the Brandenburg House. Catherine swallowed hers with somewhat less appetite because she had satisfactorily controlled the whole of Poland before. To Maria Theresa, the dish was distasteful and even shocking, but she could not see her neighbors go ahead without her, and she shared in the feast by suppressing her moral scruples. She wept, said Frederick cynically, but she kept on taking. Catherine, in 1774, signed a peace treaty with the defeated Turks. This treaty opened opportunities for Russian expansion around the Black Sea, where the Ottoman Sultan ceded control of Tatar principalities on the north coast, and where the Russians soon founded the seaport of Odessa. Territorial expansion 635, Catherine had only delayed, not altered, her plans with respect to Ottoman Turkey. She decided to neutralize the opposition of Austria. She invited Joseph II to visit her in Russia, and the two sovereigns proceeded together on a tour of her newly won Black Sea provinces. Her longtime advisor and lover, Grigory Potemkin, accompanied Catherine on this tour, which included visits to numerous towns and fortresses that Potemkin had established in the Crimea. Although the Russians had actually made significant progress in developing the region, Potemkin's enemies claimed that the new towns were nothing but a facade, thus creating the famous phrase, Potemkin villages, to mean bogus evidence of a non-existent prosperity. But Catherine achieved her main goal when Joseph II agreed to bring Austria into a war of conquest against the Ottoman Empire. 346. Emelian Pugachev, leader of the most violent, widespread peasant uprising in Russian history, was held in an iron cage before his trial and execution for treason. Bettman, Getty Images. This war was interrupted by the French Revolution, however, and both governments reduced their commitments in the Balkans to await developments in Western Europe. It became Catherine's policy to incite Austria and Prussia into a war with revolutionary France, in the name of monarchy and civilization, in order that she might have a free hand in the Polish-Turkish sphere. Meanwhile, she contributed to a collective assault on the nationalist and reforming movement among the Poles. In 1793, she arranged with Prussia for the second partition, and in 1795 with both Prussia and Austria for the third. She was the only ruler who lived to take part in all three partitions of Poland, which are described later in this chapter. 636. Her protestations of enlightenment tempt one to an ironic judgment of her career. Her foreign policy was purely expansionist and unscrupulous, and the net effect of her domestic policy, aside from a few reforms of detail, was to favor the half-Europeanized aristocracy and to extend serfdom among the people. In her defense, it may be observed that unscrupulous expansion was the accepted practice of the time, and that, domestically, probably no ruler could have corrected the 18th century serf system or the social evils from which Russia suffered. If there was to be a Russian empire, it had to be with the consent of the serf-owning gentry, which was the only articulate and politically significant class. As Catherine observed to Diderot on the subject of reforms, "You write only on paper, but I have to write on human skin, which is incomparably more irritable and ticklish." 347G. She had reason to know how easily czars and czarinas could be unseated and even murdered, and that the danger for czars came not from the peasants but from cliques of army officers and landlords. Catherine's reign evaluated 637, yet she remained attuned to Western Europe. She never thought that Russian institutions should become a model for others. She continued to recognize the cultural standards of the Enlightenment. In her later years, she gave careful attention to her favorite grandson, Alexander, closely supervising his education, which she planned on the Western European model. She gave him as a tutor the Swiss philosopher La Harpe, who filled his mind with humane and liberal sentiments on the duties of princes. Trained by Catherine as a kind of ideal ruler, Alexander I was destined to cut a wide circle in the affairs of Europe, to help defeat Napoleon Bonaparte, to preach peace and freedom, and to suffer from the same internal cultural divisions and frustrations by which European educated Russians were often afflicted. The limitations of enlightened despotism. Enlightened despotism, seen in retrospect, foreshadowed an age of revolutionary changes and even signified a preliminary effort to revolutionize society by authoritative action from above. People were told by their own governments that reforms were needed, that many privileges, special liberties, or tax exemptions were bad, that the past was a source of confusion, injustice, or inefficiency in the present. The state rose up as more completely sovereign, whether acting frankly in its own interest or claiming to act in the interest of its people. All old and established rights were brought into question: rights of kingdoms and provinces, orders and classes, legal bodies and corporate groups. Enlightened despotism overrode or exterminated the Society of Jesus, the Parliament of Paris, the autonomy of Bohemia, and the independence of Poland. Customary and common law was pushed aside by authoritative legal codes. Governments, by opposing the special powers of the church and the nobility, tended to make all persons into uniform and equal subjects. To this extent, enlightened despotism favored equality before the law, but it could go only a certain distance in this direction. The king was, after all, a hereditary aristocrat himself, and no government can be revolutionary to the point of breaking up its own foundations. Even before the French Revolution, enlightened despotism had run its course. Everywhere the despots, for reasons of politics if not of principle, had reached a point beyond which they could not go. In France, Louis XVI had appeased the privileged classes. In the Austrian Empire, Joseph's failure to appease them threw them into open revolt. In Prussia and in Russia, the brilliant reigns of Frederick and Catherine actually increased the power of landlordism for most people in the countryside. Almost everywhere, there was an aristocratic and even feudal resurgence. Religion also was renewing itself in many places. Many were again saying that kingship was in a sense divine, and a new alliance was forming between the throne and the altar. The French Revolution, by terrifying the old vested interests, was to accelerate and embitter an aristocratic and monarchical reaction that had already begun. Monarchy in Europe, ever since the Middle Ages, had generally been a centralizing but progressive institution that set itself against the feudal and ecclesiastical powers. 638, enlightened despotism was the culmination of the historic development of European monarchies. After the enlightened despots, and after the French Revolution, monarchy became on the whole nostalgic and backward-looking, supported most ardently by the churches and aristocracies that it had once tried to subdue, and least of all by those who felt in themselves the surge of progress and a more enlightened future. 38. The Partitions of Poland 639. The fate of 18th century Poland has been mentioned as a consequence of the growing power of the newer Central European monarchies. But the partitions of Polish territories also illustrate the assumptions and practices of the so-called enlightened despots. Apart from the still somewhat non-European state of Russia, Poland in the 18th century was by far the largest state in Europe. It reached at the beginning of the century from the Baltic almost to the Black Sea and extended eastward for 800 miles across the North European plain. But it was the classic example, along with the Holy Roman Empire, of an older political structure that failed to develop modern, centralizing government institutions. See maps, pp. 205, 206. It fell into ever deeper anarchy and confusion. Without army, revenues, or administration, and internally divided among parties forever at cross purposes, the country was a perpetual theater for foreign diplomatic maneuvering, and was finally absorbed into the territories of its growing neighbors. The Polish kings were chosen in elections that became an object of regular international interference. A movement for reform therefore began to gather strength after the 1730s, and Polish patriots sought to do away with the liberum veto and other elements in the constitution that made government impossible. The reformers were repeatedly frustrated, however, by the influence of Catherine the Great and other foreign rulers who preferred a Poland in which they could intervene at will. Catherine's candidate for the Polish throne, Stanislas Poniatowski, won an election in 1763, thereby giving her new influence over Poland's domestic affairs. She declared herself protector of the Polish liberties. It was to the Russian advantage to maintain the existing state of affairs in Poland, rather than to divide the country with neighbors who might exclude Russian influence from their own spheres. The Prussian government, which was eager to join the old Duchy of Prussia with its other territories in the east, developed a greater interest in dividing Poland as a means to enhance its own strategic position. Interference in Polish elections 349-640. The opportunity for Prussia presented itself in 1772, when Russia's war with Ottoman Turkey destabilized the situation in Eastern Europe. The Russian victories in this war were so overwhelming that both Austrians and Prussians feared an enduring Russian disruption of the balance of power. The Prussians, therefore, came forward with a proposal to prevent an Austro-Russian war and to preserve the balance in Eastern Europe by leaving the Ottoman Empire more or less intact. Looking for an alternative to Russian expansion into Ottoman lands, the Prussians proposed that all three European powers should annex territory from Poland instead. The proposition was accepted by all three parties. Poland was thus sacrificed. By the first partition in 1772, its outer territories were cut away. Russia took an eastern slice around the city of Vitebsk. Austria took a southern slice, the region known as Galicia. Prussia realized its territorial ambitions by taking the Pomeranian borderland in West Prussia and creating a solid Prussian bloc from the Elbe to the borders of Lithuania. See map P 220, panel 4. The partition sobered the Poles, who renewed their efforts at a national revival, hoping to create an effective sovereignty that could secure the country against outsiders. But the Polish movement lacked deep popular strength, for it was confined mainly to nobles, whose conflicts had brought the country to ruin. The mass of the serf population and the numerous Jewish communities did not much care at this time whether they were governed by Poles, Russians, or Germans. 3 partitions of Poland. Nevertheless, beginning in 1788, a reform party gathered strength. One of its members was King Stanislas Poniatowski himself, who had begun his reign as a protege of the Russian Empress. The reformers produced a new constitution in 1791. It made the Polish kingship hereditary, thus strengthening the executive government, and it reduced the powers of the great magnates while giving political rights to many burghers in the towns. By this time, however, the governments of Eastern Europe were afraid of the French Revolution. Denouncing the Polish reformers as French-inspired Jacobins, Catherine the Great said she would fight Jacobinism and beat it in Poland. In collusion with a few disgruntled Polish noblemen, she sent an army into Poland and destroyed the Constitution of 1791. In agreement with Prussia, she then carried out the Second Partition in 1793. In 1794, Thaddeus Kosciuszko led a more revolutionary political movement, which included even a proposed abolition of serfdom. Although it received no aid from the revolutionaries then governing France, it was crushed in the general European counter-revolution when Russian and Prussian armies again invaded Poland, defeated Kosciuszko, and in a third partition in 1795, divided what remained of the country among themselves and Austria. Poland as a political entity ceased to exist, see map P351, panel 2. Many advanced thinkers of the day praised the partitions of Poland as a triumph of enlightened rulers, putting an end to an old nuisance. The 3 partitioning powers justified their conduct on various grounds and even took pride in it as an enlightened diplomatic achievement, by which they had prevented war among themselves. It was argued also that the partitions of Poland put an end to an old cause of international rivalry and war. replacing anarchy with more stable governments in a large area of Eastern Europe. It is a fact that Poland had been scarcely more independent before the partitions than after. It is to be noted also, though nationalist arguments were not used at the time, that on national grounds the Poles themselves had no claim to large parts of the old Poland. The regions taken by Russia were inhabited overwhelmingly by Belarusians, 641, and Ukrainians, among whom the Poles were mainly a landlord class. Russia, even after the Third Partition, reached only to the true ethnic border of Poland. But later, after the fall of Napoleon, by general international agreement, the Russian sphere was extended deep into the territory inhabited by Poles. The partitions of Poland, however extenuated, were nevertheless a great shock to the old system of Europe. Edmund Burke in England prophetically saw in the first partition the crumbling of the old international order. His diagnosis was a shrewd assessment of Europe's changing system of state power. The principle of the balance of power had been historically invoked to preserve the independence of European states and to secure weak or small countries against universal monarchy. It was now used to destroy the independence of a weak but ancient kingdom. Poland was not the first European kingdom to be partitioned, but it was the first to be partitioned without war and the first to disappear totally. That Poland was partitioned without war, a source of great satisfaction to the partitioning powers, was still a very unsettling fact. It was alarming for a huge state to vanish simply by cold diplomatic calculation. It seemed that no established rights were safe, even in peacetime. The partitions of Poland showed that in a world where great powers had arisen through control of a modern state apparatus, it was dangerous not to be strong. They suggested that any area failing to develop a sovereign state capable of keeping out foreign infiltration, and so situated as to be within the reach of the great powers of Europe, was unlikely to retain its independence. In this way, the history of 18th century Poland anticipated, for example, the partitions of Africa a century later, when Africa too, lacking strong governments, was almost totally divided, without war, among half a dozen states of Europe. 350 debate over the partitions, 642 Poland, since the 18th century. The top panel shows, in simplified form, the ethnic composition of the area included in the Poland of 1772. In addition to languages shown, Yiddish was spoken by the large scattered Jewish population. The line set in 1795 as the western boundary of Russia persists through later changes. It reappears as the eastern border of Napoleon's Grand Duchy and of Congress Poland. After the First World War, the victorious Allies contemplated much this same line as Poland's eastern frontier, the dotted line in the fourth panel, known as the Curzon Line. But the Poles in 1920 to 1921 conquered territory farther east. After the Second World War, the Russians pushed the Poles back to the same basic line, but compensated Poland with territory taken from Germany, as far west as the River Oder and its tributary, the Nysa. The position of Warsaw in each panel shows how Poland has been shoved westward, 351, 644. Moreover, the partitions of Poland, while maintaining a balance of power in Eastern Europe, profoundly changed the balance of Europe as a whole. The disappearance of Poland was a blow to France, which had long used Poland, as it had used Hungary and Turkey as an outpost of French influence in Eastern Europe. The three Eastern powers expanded their territory, while France enjoyed henceforth no permanent growth. Eastern Europe bulked larger than ever before in the affairs of Europe. Prussia, Russia, and the Austrian Empire became contiguous. Although they had drawn somewhat differently on Western European methods of statecraft and military organization to build their power, they had a common interest and objective in Eastern Europe: the repression of Polish resistance to their rule. Polish resistance, dating from before the partitions and continuing thereafter, became the earliest example of modern revolutionary nationalism in Europe. The independence of Poland, and of other submerged nationalities, later attracted wide support in Western Europe, while the three great monarchies of Eastern Europe were drawn together in common opposition to national liberation. This fact, plus the fact that the Eastern monarchies were primarily landlord states, accentuated the political and social division of Europe in the 19th century between a Western Europe that inclined to be liberal and an Eastern Europe that inclined to be reactionary. The subsequent political divergence of Western and Eastern Europe might therefore be compared to the earlier North South religious divergence of Protestant and Catholic states, in that both the political and the religious differences contributed to the fragmentation of Europe and to the emerging nationalisms that would later shape the major modern European conflicts. The first great political assault on the older social order and political system in 18th century Europe, however, came from the enlightened despots who destroyed the Kingdom of Poland.